Okay, hello everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today as people shuffle in. My name is Mohammed Nabilsi and I'm with the Palestinian Youth Movement.
And I'm Rama, also with the Palestinian Youth Movement, and Mohammed and I will be moderating today's webinar.
So before we begin with our speakers, we would like to share before we begin with our speakers, we would also like to share more about PYM and NSJP and to thank our endorsing organizations. This event is part of a political education series that the PYM and NSJP, the Palestinian Youth Movement and National Students for Justice in Palestine, are co-hosting. PYM's Student Empowerment Committee and NSJP are collaborating to put on ongoing political education series to continue offering students and community members resources and to support building out the political cohesion and capacity necessary for expanding student and community organizing and mobilizing efforts. The Palestinian Youth Movement, or PYM, is a grassroots movement of Palestinian and Arab youth who are taking an active role in our struggle for liberation of our homeland and people. The PYM brings together youth across political, cultural, and social backgrounds to organize towards justice and liberation, for the right of return of all refugees, and towards the dismantlement of Zionism. PYM currently has 10 chapters in various cities across North America, as well as members in several more locations. And as we're speaking here today, we're continuing to grow. We organize within our communities locally, and given the pandemic, for example, our chapters have been responding to the needs of the wider refugee and immigrant communities across North America. PYM chapters are building mutual aid networks and resources for Arab, Palestinian, refugee, and immigrant communities throughout various cities, including San Diego, Toronto, Houston, Dearborn, and more. Our chapters have created programs for Arab youth to learn about their history, identity, culture, organized to build refugee services and empowerment, local BDS campaigns, and have developed political education, resources, and workshops. We also organize national efforts such as our biannual summer schools for Palestinian Arab youth, our student empowerment committee that develops organizing and political education resources and trainings to strengthen the student movement for Palestine, and our Ghassan Kanafani Resistance Arts Scholarship, which you'll hear about more in a bit. Finally, the PYM engages in various joint struggle efforts, including delegations such as our Palestinian Youth Organizer Delegation to South Africa and our Indigenous Youth Organizer Delegation to Palestine. We are also organizing against Zionism, surveillance, militarism, and policing, combating surveillance programs that target Muslim, Arab, Black, and Brown, and Indigenous communities, drawing the links between Zionism and Islamophobia. Our members have also organized support for political prisoners and their families. You can learn more about our work at our website, pymusa.com, and we encourage folks to apply to become members of the PYM or friends of the PYM. and to organize with us in coalitional efforts. So now I'll speak a little bit about National Students for Justice in Palestine, or NSJP. NSJP is a collective body of organizers within the Palestinian Solidarity movement that supports over 250 student groups across US campuses by hosting annual conferences, developing a shared agenda, providing a platform for collaboration, and setting a political vision for our network, as well as connecting with the broader global movement for freedom, equality, and justice in Palestine. As a national organization, NSJP seeks to develop and provide resources to local SJP chapters across North America. NSJP is currently developing and revitalizing regional communication channels in order to more tangibly connect and assist the needs of local SJP chapters. National SJP aims to create an organizing culture that centers internationalism, joint struggle, and most importantly, the demands put forth by our national liberation movement. NSJP hosts an annual conference which brings student activists and organizers from across North America to engage in critical workshops, develop political education, and build community with other Palestine solidarity organizers. NSJP has coordinated a number of regional and national efforts that have propelled the demands of Palestinian calls for freedom, justice, and liberation. In December of 2019, for example, NSJP mobilized over 100 SJP chapters across 4 countries, among them the US, Canada, Germany, and South Africa, to sign a statement explicitly condemning Trump's executive order, redefining anti-Semitism to include anti-Zionism. Coming on our 10th anniversary as an organization, NSJP is dedicated to uplifting calls for freedom, justice, and liberation for all Palestinians. And you can learn more about NSJP's work at nationalsjp.org. At this moment, we would also like to thank all of the organizations that that have endorsed this event, and you can see the list of those organizations on the PowerPoint screen here in a moment. As you can see on our screen, we have dozens of organizations across the US that represent various constituencies, and we are so thankful for your support and for uplifting and supporting our webinar today. And I'll now pass it to Rama.
So we want to thank you all for joining us today as we commemorate the 72nd memory of the Nakba under the banner of From Nakba to Return, the ongoing struggle for Palestinian liberation. This is exactly where we find ourselves today, in the ongoing struggle for Palestinian liberation, which began well before the Nakba, and of which the return of all Palestinians to their homeland is a core demand. We as Palestinians annually commemorate the Nakba on May 15th through community events, protests, workshops, and so on. And throughout these few days, we've been commemorating the Nakba online through social media and through webinars like this one. We would have rather been in the streets today, convening our communities locally, but we are adapting our programming to the current conditions brought on by the COVID pandemic and shifting much of our work to COVID support efforts to meet the needs of our communities. As many of you know, May 15th marks the Palestinian Nakba, or catastrophe, which befell the Palestinians with the establishment of the State of Israel, resulting in the uprooting and displacement of nearly 800 Palestinians from our lands. Today, we know that about 70% of our people live outside their historic homeland as refugees and exiles. And so 72 years since the Nakba, Palestinians will show you that the Nakba was not just a single moment in time, but that it is ongoing and that it continues to shape the everyday lives of Palestinians everywhere. We are a fragmented people. We live in such varied places and proximities to Palestine, under the boot of Zionist colonization and siege in Palestine, in the refugee camps of Lebanon, and in the far diaspora in Europe and North America. These are just some examples of where we are today. And as Palestinian youth today, we comprise the third generation since the Nakba. And we grew up without a national liberation movement through which we could struggle for our return and liberation. Despite where we find ourselves, we are taking on that responsibility of rebuilding this movement because we truly believe that it will be a grassroots power of our people that will carry our struggle forward and guarantee that our demands to return are met. So the challenge ahead of us as Palestinian youth today is how do we rebuild a transnational, popular, and democratic Palestinian national liberation movement? And there, how do we center the right of return in our movement building? And so with that, we're honored and excited to be joined by Palestinian artists, writers, scholars, organizers, who really embody the different aspects and generations of our struggle, and who will be speaking to my second question on the importance of centering the right of return in our organizing. So a quick overview of the agenda. We will hear from Lina Abu Jarade and Suzanne Abul Hawa, followed by Dr. Salman Abu Sitta, and we'll conclude with Nadia Younes. We will be taking questions throughout, and we'll wrap up with ways that you can plug in and take action with us in this period. So to go over some quick housekeeping tips, because we are meeting virtually, we are streaming this right now through Facebook. So please share it from your organizational accounts as well as your own individual social media accounts. As I said, we will be taking questions throughout the webinar. So leave your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom. And after each speaker, we will take a few questions from there. All of the materials and links and projects mentioned throughout the webinar will be sent in a follow-up email. And as a disclaimer, in case any technical difficulties do come up, please be patient with us. And if you're having any technical difficulties, please message the host in the chat box, and we'll do our best to help you throughout the webinar. So with that, I'll pass it back to Mohammed.
Thank you, Rama. At this moment, I'd like to introduce our first set of speakers. We're excited to have Lina join us. Lina Abu Jarade is a Palestinian Jordanian artist who has spent the last 10 years using different art mediums in order to tell the story of Palestine and the Middle East through murals and videos that combine poetry and art. She has presented her work in over 10 countries and is the winner of several international awards, including the Plural and Film Festival International Jury Award, as well as PYM's Ghassan Kanafani Resistance Arts Scholarship. She won first place in 2019 and will be a member of the judging panel for the 2020 Ghassan Kanafani Resistance Arts Scholarship. Today, she will be performing her piece, HANDALA'S Dream, and speaking to the importance of resistance through art. We are also honored to have Suzanne Abul Hawa join us today. Suzanne is a novelist, poet, and activist. Her debut novel, Mornings in Jenin, was an international bestseller translated into 32 languages, making her one of the most widely read Arab authors of all time. Her second novel, The Blue Between Sky and Water, was likewise translated into 20 languages. Her other books include a poetry collection, My Voice Sought the Wind, and many anthologies, articles, and essays. Her forthcoming book, Against the Loveless World, will be coming out this August. She's also the founder of Playgrounds for Palestine, an organization dedicated to defending the right to play for Palestinians living under Israeli occupation and in refugee camps and elsewhere. Suzanne will be reading an excerpt from her novel, Mornings in Jenin. Afterward, both Lina and Suzanne will speak to the importance of cultural production for our struggle for return and liberation of our homeland. We will now have Lina share her screen and present the Handala dream video.
Lena, just unmute yourself. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
There you go. We can hear you now.
Okay. An expulsion, a crooked road, the weight of war held on an old man's back, and in the bare feet of children, now refugees. Tomorrow we will come back, they say, but they walk towards a tomorrow that holds only apologies for bringing more blood and loss. The road is silent. There is only the sad echo of feet moving away from home. Can you understand what only the olive trees know? لا, لن يعرفوا أبداً، فأشجار زيتوننا وحدها شهدت كل شيء. تبادلت يومها نظرات مواساة، وانتهت بسقوط المنطق أسفلها، ومن دون ظلالها مشينا خارج المكان. بكيتها وأبكتني، وأنين الوجهة خلفنا أثقل ظهري، ومن شدة الأنين كحت الأصوات. فلا صوت اليوم يعلو صوت أمي، ومعتصماه ومعتصماه. أمسكت بيدها، عانقتها بشدة خشية الفراق، رددتها مرارا حتى تلاشينا نحن والصوت والمدينة في الحيطان. كنت ابنها الصغير، رأيتهم كيف انتشلوا إخوتي من يديها تباعا، فباتت عين بحيفا وأخرى بيافا، صاح الثغر بعكا وانفطر القلب في غزة. Her beaches suicide on the edges of our eyelids. The tears are a river that start from the delta of the Nakba and end only with liberation. On that day, man and earth and sky shed tears in bitter goodbye, in protest of a conspiracy of hate, born long before 1948. Tears, they still cry. Tears born of a love that will never die. أحبوك كثيرا، عذلتهم على حبهم أول الأمر، ولكني عندما قرأت لدرويش عرفت كيف يكون الحب بذلك الصدق، عذرتهم، وآخرون تألموا لألمك وانقطعت أنفاسهم بفراقك، فمن جدران الخزان على الحدود صاح كنفاني متأثرا بجراحك، وحاك من طريق الوداع قصصا خلدت ذكراك. فهل تلوموني؟ Do you blame them? They are a people made colorblind, forbidden from their blue skies and a kaleidoscope of clean clothes hung from their ancestors' homes. ومن خلف تلك البيوت اختفت السماء والحقول، ثم اختفى كل شيء وراء حائطكم، فكانت كالبيت دون دعاماته كالشعر دون كلماته، باتت أبياته هشة هرئة، وخاننا كل شيء حتى الزمان بعظمته خاننا. Stops for no one, not even a child flung in the space between somewhere and nowhere, a child who holds prayers and memories he never had a chance to make tight before bed. He is torn between the living and the dead. His name is Hamdallah. He is 10 years old, and he will remain. 10 سنوات. هذا كان عمري عندما تركتك. كنت ذلك الطفل بلا حذاء. على بابك ودعت عمري. فلن أكبر حتى أعود. سأظل في 10 أعيش رافضا ويداي خلفي وأنتم. Do you wait for a solution? Does your hand extend for deceitful promises or helpless UN resolutions? Because he searches for the solution. في داخلي ورفضت أي قضية إلا قضيتي. But they wait for the olive branches to map their way home. Barefoot, he chooses to walk on thorns. فأنا شوكة في حلقهم تذكرهم أنهم يوما تركوا أختهم خلفهم. وما زالوا يلومونني لحبي لك. And from his love came art and life. The art of resistance whispers the sound of worshippers' feet on the cobblestones of Jerusalem. It splashes me with the foam of Haifa's waves through Kanafani's punctuation and the fragrance of orange blossoms in the spaces between Darwish's words. بين تلك الأسطر تعلمت الكثير وفي ثناياها كانت طفولتي ألعابي والأراجيح. أما حمائم الحي فتعلمت معها الطيران وأكثر. علمتني كيف يكون الموت عرساً وكيف ترسم الحياة في ذات العرس. كيف تكون الفرشاة صبراً ويلبس الصبر ثوبه الأحمر. علمتني أن نجوم السماء هي الأرواحهم وأن السماء ستبقى منارة في الليل. The dove of peace sailed away into a late autumn, waiting for the day that the spring of our conscience will bloom. Do you hear the echo of its song, the wings that beat in your chest? We were all born in a sunrise, cradling a holy land. Do you see the sunrise in the horizon, beyond a blue sky, trapped in our dreams? And in that dream, تذكر درويش كل كلمة قالها فيك فابتسم مرحبا. سيدتي أستحق لأنك سيدتي أستحق الحياة. وعاد الحب لينبض في أقدام كنفاني وظهر من بعيد هناك ناجي العلي. جلس الجميع يشهدون اللقاء وترنمت العصافير بعبق الوطن. We were all born in a sunrise cradling a holy land, and we should die in that sunrise.
Lina, I love that. I love the way you combined poetry and art and video and crossover with Arabic and English. It's brilliant.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so that's a tough act to follow. All I have are just a few excerpts. So I'm going to read a very short excerpt from my new novel, Against the Loveless World. And then I'm going to read two other short excerpts from Mornings in Jenin that pertain to the Nakba. Okay, so this is from a chapter called Dance Ruby River. I don't remember the first time I danced. Women of my generation were born dancing. It was just something we did when we gathered. We'd form a circle, clapping and singing as each of us entered the middle to roll our hips. But I knew early on, by the way people watched me, that the way I danced was enchanting. When the music plays, my body moves as it wishes. I never tried to control anything, not my body, not my music, not the fate. It was complete surrender to music and all the unseen, unknowable forces it inspired. Rhythm rubbed against my soul and wrapped around my breath. Maybe that's what people saw, because dancing is the nearest I've ever come to true faith. Eastern dance, what most people who don't know better call belly dancing, might look like controlled, orchestrated movement, but it's exactly the opposite. Our dance is about chaos and anarchy. It's the antithesis of control. It's about relinquishing power over one's body, bestowing autonomy on every bone, ligament, nerve, and muscle fiber. I suppose this is true of every form of native dance, but all I know are the rhythms of the Levant, Babylon, the Khalij, and North Africa. This is the music that rooted in my body as it matured from infancy, then settled in my bones. The lyrics of Kulthum, the plaint of a nai, the melody of a qanun, or the rasp of a oud are the sounds of my life. They echo inside me through time with the stories those ancient instruments inspired. As much as I love the sounds of India, the complex resonance of the sitar or the high-pitched strings of a tumbi, or the deep percussions and multi-layered rhythms of African drums and the piercing precision of a xylophone. Though they move my body, they do not reach the depths from which music transports me, because they are the sounds of other people's and stories I only heard as an adult. Music is like spoken language, inextricable from its culture. If you don't learn a language early in life, its words will forever come out wrinkled and accented by another world, no matter how well you memorize or love the vocabulary, grammar, and cadences of a new language. This is why foreign belly dancers have always bothered me. The use of our music as a prop to wiggle and shimmy and jump around offends me. Eastern music is the soundtrack of me. Dancing is the only nation I ever claimed, the only religion I comprehend. When I see women belly dance to music they do not understand, in clothes of a people they do not know, or worse, disdain, I feel they are colonizing me and all the Arab women who are the keepers of our traditions and heritage. So that's the new book. And the excerpts from Mornings in Jenin are exactly at the moment of the Nakba when the families were kicked out of Ain Hod. So this is immediately after the violence and the chaos of expulsion. Hassan shuffled restlessly between his wounded brother Darwish, his inconsolable wife, his terrified son, and his bewildered father, until finally he succumbed to exhaustion and slept on the ground among merciless mosquitoes, a stone to rest his head. But not even sleep could assuage the inadequacy he felt. He had failed to protect his family. He could not provide assurance, nor could he bring Ismail back. Jiddo, can we go home now? Yusuf asked his grandfather. Yahya could not lie, nor could he tell the truth. He kissed his grandson, pulled him closer, tighter to his chest, and said, Get some rest, ya ibni. Get some rest now, ya habibi. They tried to go back the next day, but the guns behind them forbade a return home. For 3 days and 2 nights, they made their way up and down unforgiving hills, under the sun's glare and the unseen but sure watch of snipers. A diabetic boy and his grandmother fell and died. One woman miscarried, and the dehydrated bodies of 2 babies went limp in their mother's arms. Jenin was as far as they could go, and they rested wherever there was space among the flood of refugees converging from other villages. Residents of those towns helped as much as they could, giving away their food, blankets, and water, and fitting as many as possible into their homes in that time of crisis. Soon, Jordan, Iraq, and Syria gave out a few tents, and a refugee camp sprang up in Jenin, where the villagers of Ain Hod could stand on the hills and look back at the homes to which they could never return. And so it was that 8 centuries after its founding by a general of Salah ad-Din's army in 1189 AD, Ain Hod was cleared of its Palestinian children. Yahya tried to calculate the number of generations who had lived and died in that village, and he came up with 40. It was a task made simple by the way Arabs named their children to tell the story of their genealogy, conferring 5 or 6 names from the child's direct lineage and in proper order. Thus, Yahya tallied 40 generations of living, now stolen. 40 generations of childbirth and funerals, weddings, dance, prayer, and scraped knees. 40 generations of sin and charity, of cooking, toiling, and idling, of friendships and animosities and pacts, of rain and lovemaking. 40 generations with their imprinted memories, secrets, and scandals, all carried away by the notion of entitlement of another people, who would settle in the vacancy and proclaim it all that was left in the way of architecture, orchards, wells, flowers, and charm, as the heritage of Jewish foreigners arriving from Europe, Russia, the United States, and other corners of the globe. In the sorrow of a history buried alive, the year 1948 in Palestine fell from the calendar into exile, ceasing to reckon the marching count of days, months, and years, and instead becoming an infinite mist of one moment in history. The 12 months of that year rearranged themselves and swirled aimlessly in the heart of Palestine. The old folks of Ain Hod would die refugees in the camp, bequeathing to their heirs the large iron keys to their ancestral homes, the crumbling land registers issued by the Ottomans, the deeds from the British Mandate, their memories and love of the land, and the dauntless will not to leave the spirit of 40 generations trapped beneath the subversion of thieves. And so this last scene follows Yahya, who, a refugee in Jenin now, goes back for a second time to his village. Yahya shaved, he dressed himself, going through the quiet ritual he had employed weeks earlier. But this time he performed the rites of the forbidden return with the deliberate strokes of experience. Yusuf sat by his side in the sunshine, watching the slow motions of the razor along his grandfather's jawline, dazzled by the sun's dance along the blade. He observed the dirty white foam in the rinse cup, the spots on Yahya's hands, and the dirt beneath his nails. And he committed to memory the precision with which Yahya trimmed his salty black mustache and waxed its tips to perfect curve and symmetry, the mantle of a patriarch. No one knew exactly when Yahya died, but by the time the Red Crescent was able to retrieve his corpse from the Israeli authorities, Dalia had miscarried again. Everyone in the camp agreed that Yahya had known that when he again set foot outside of the boundaries of that eternal 1948, he would be gone forever. Haj Salim was sure that Yahya had gone back to die where he was supposed to die. And when people spoke of Yahya's passing, they said he died from the malady of a broken heart. The actual cause of death was a gunshot wound. Ain Hod was being settled by Jewish artists from France and was gaining a reputation as a secluded paradise. Yahya had been spotted on his first trip by one of the Jewish settlers, and when he returned, waiting soldiers had shot him for trespassing. Thank you.
Thank you both, Lina and Suzanne, for the beautiful presentations. Both were extremely moving, and I'm so happy to have you both. And now what we'll do is we want to transition to having a discussion between Suzanne and Lina about the role of cultural production and the arts as part of the broader resistance that Palestinians engage in. And so I will now pass it off to both of you just to have a brief conversation about the role of cultural production and arts in resistance.
And maybe Mohammed too, if there are questions, you just send them to us. So Lina, I'll let you speak to that first, and I'll take my cue from you.
Thank you. So Suzanne, I'm sure you can relate to this, but I always find it interesting when this type of discussion comes up of how cultural production is considered a great addition to Palestinian forms of resistance. But when we think of the definition of culture being the sum of human invention, culture is not only necessary, but it's inevitable. And I've read that Kanafani strongly believed that cultural expression is as important a form of resistance as armed struggle. And I think the reason that is because although we're scattered in different geographical locations and we're living different experiences. So when you think of Palestinians in the West Bank versus Gaza, versus Palestinians living in occupied 1948 lands, versus all of us all over the world, what cultural expression does is it provides an affirmation of our collective political identity. And that's so important because in cases of colonialism, we have this more powerful side trying to rewrite and control the narrative of the occupied. And when it comes to the Zionist project, no doubt one of its biggest goals is to destroy or to hijack Palestinian culture. And despite the massive amount of resources that have been allocated for this purpose, in my opinion, they are failing. They have failed and are continuing to fail. And we owe that to decades of work by artists and writers who built the independent Palestinian characteristics that we associate with Palestinian culture. So when you think of all of these symbols that are included in my artwork, and Suzanne, your work, that are globally accepted to present the Palestinian cause, you know, like the olive tree, the cactus plant, the kufiyeh, despite efforts to steal and undermine these symbols, we continue to reclaim them, and it's kind of become a brand to our cause. And the reason why this is specifically important to Palestinians in the diaspora is because, you know, we might have never entered Palestine. So I'm a third generation Palestinian, and I've never entered foot in Palestine. And in fact, the first time I actually associated myself as a Palestinian was in the 9th grade, when I saw a painting by the great Ismail Shammout. And the first novel I read was actually Mornings in Jenin. So that's the brilliant thing, is we have a generation of Palestinians in the diaspora inspiring another generation of Palestinians also in the diaspora. So for me, it's a matter of keeping the Palestinian narrative for the right of return alive.
No, I agree with you in particular about this this kind of sense that art is kind of an addition to something more substantive and political. Going a step further, you know, art, literature, cuisine, our culture predates our struggle even. You know, we're an ancient society with poetry and food and folklore and songs that predate Israel by a few millennia. And so I think, you know, culture should not just be viewed as a form of resistance. It is the basis of our identity, of our collective identity, and it's how we pass our culture on to future generations, especially since so many of us live in a diaspora. Literature becomes existential even. You know, every culture is defined, every society rather is defined by the cultural face it puts forth to the world. You know, you look at Frida Kahlo and you immediately think Mexico, you know, or so I just culture and literature and art are the face of societies, and when you are a society whose existence is denied, everything you do, whether it's overtly about resistance or not, becomes a political act, because it's an affirmation of your presence in the world. It's an affirmation of the roots that you have on this earth and this particular spot in the world. And roots that are quite literally, as you said, being pulled out from the ground. So while I think, yes, there is such a thing as, you know, resistance art and resistance culture, I don't like those things to eclipse literature itself, to eclipse the art, because these productions are worthy in their own right of being seen, of being passed on to other generations. When, you know, I think our generation ends up writing a lot about occupation and resistance, simply because, you know, we live this condition and it's emotional and it's so close to us. But we don't write with that aim in mind. You know, all of us kind of exist in this collective wound, no matter how divided we are, whether we're divided geographically, linguistically, culturally, financially. We all share this single collective wound that began in 1945 48, actually 47, slightly preceding that. And so we function inside this wound. And so it's natural for much of our cultural productions to have expressions to express that wound. But we should think of literature and art as being worthy in their own right, separate from what they contribute to liberation. Because this is, you know, just like you said, the first book you read was Mornings in Janine. By the way, I'm hugely honored to hear that. But I'm moved by that because it's like, that's like, you're my most important audience. Like, Palestinian, like young Palestinians are, to me, are the most important readership. So it's not, so Mia, maybe I guess you could see it as a form of resistance by passing on, you know, our identity and our history to other generations. But it's not, I don't see it, I don't write as a way to kind of, you know, speak to the world, but rather just to tell stories, to tell our stories honestly, and let them sort of let these productions mature in the world on their own. I think we've taken a lot of time.
Are we I'm wondering if we have any more time.
Yeah, thank you so much, both Suzanne and Lina. I wish we had some more time to hear from both of you and to field questions, actually. So what I want to do is, just for the sake of time, to come back for, if there is questions to pose to you. And so we have questions and we'll save them just for the sake of time to kind of move along with the agenda. But we really appreciate your contributions. You know, even the framing that you both just provided really forced me to reflect on my own experiences growing up in a Palestinian household. My mother, you know, she obviously, you know, I never thought of the things that she contributed to my upbringing as cultural production. But when you frame it, Suzanne, in terms of like the fact that it is not just about resistance, it's our identity and the broader, really capturing the full range of our experiences as human beings. You know, whether it's the decorations in our homes, whether it's the cuisines that we eat, whether it's the clothings that we wear. And then I think about my father, who also happens to be an artist, who's in both my mother and my father in the other room watching this. My father is an artist, an art teacher, and not all of his art is about Palestine, but it's about identity and it's about our experiences, as you say. And so I really appreciate both of you, and I wish we could hear from you more, but we'll have to transition. And I'm going to go ahead and take this as a moment just to quickly and briefly plug the PYM Ghassan Kanafani Scholarship, and you know, of which Lina is the 2019 winner. The Ghassan Kanafani Scholarship, the art scholarship, encourages Palestinian youth in the US and Canada to create art in multiple forms. Every year we collect submissions, and the top 3 winners receive scholarship money and are published in a printed anthology with 20 other top submissions. This scholarship is the first of its kind in the US, and it gives Palestinians in the diaspora an opportunity to reflect on their identities and positionality and their relationships to Palestine. And we'll be able to provide a link in the chat for where you can purchase copies of it. And if you're interested in sponsoring our scholarship, we can use all the support we need. That's all going to be available in the slide, or we'll attach a link in the chat. And we'll have an online launch on May 31st, May 31st, 4 p.m. PST, 7 p.m. Eastern. We'll also be putting a call for submissions on June 1st for Palestinian youth between the ages of 18 and 25. So please circulate the call for submissions. Thank you again, Lina and Suzanne, for your presentations, for your discussion, and thank you for joining us, of course. And now I'll go ahead and pass over the microphone to Rama to introduce Dr. Salman Abu Sitta.
Thank you, Muhammad, and thank you, Suzanne and Lena, for sharing your work. It's incredibly moving, and we're so honored to have you. For the sake of time, we'll be moving on to our next guest. We are incredibly excited and honored to have Dr. Salman Abu Sitta with us today. Dr. Salman Abu Sitta is the founder and president of the Palestine Land Society in London. The Palestine Land Society is an organization dedicated to the documentation of Palestine's land and people. Many of you know Dr. Salman Abu Sitta's work, especially for his groundbreaking work of actually mapping out the return of Palestinians to historic Palestine. He is also the author of 6 books on Palestine, including the Atlas of Palestine from 1917 to 1966, published in both English and Arabic, as well as the Atlas of the Return Journey. He's also published 300 papers and articles on Palestinian refugees, the right of return, and the history of the Nakba and human rights. In 2016, he published a memoir titled Mapping My Return, in which he described his life in Palestine and his long struggle as a refugee to return home. So with that, I'll pass it on to you, Doctor, to speak about the Nakba and the right of return, and share more about your work with us.
Thank you, Rama. Thank you. It's a very sad day that we remember a Nakba. It's now 25,000 days since we left our home or expelled from our homes. It's a sad day. But it's a happy day for me, because today I see the young people are remembering Palestine, working for Palestine, working for return. Those young people who were dismissed by the Zionist leader, David Ben-Gurion, when he said, the young will forget. Well, the young did not forget. The young are all over the world, and they are spreading the word about Palestine. I sometimes feel ashamed of the generation we live in, because the future generation will read in their history books that we lost Palestine and the Zionists took over Palestine. But what really gives me great hope is that this event, although it is the most tragic event in the history of Palestine, really the most tragic event in 4,000 years of history, it is unprecedented even in any colonial history. All the colonial projects in the past were done 200 years ago or more. They sailed in sailing ships and they carried swords and arrows and all that. But in our case, Palestine was taken away from us under the shadow of the United Nations. When we have telephones, telegraphs, we have New York Times, we have communications. How could that happen? How could this unusual event happen? At a time in the middle of the 20th century, when all the colonial soldiers of Europe packed their bags and left Asia and Africa going back to Europe, we are confronted with a new army from Europe of settlers from Russia and Poland marching in the opposite direction towards Palestine. They took it by force, by real force. 120,000 soldiers in 9 brigades in 31 military operations depopulated 560,000 villages. And that, of course, could not have happened just like that. It was propelled by over 60 massacres in villages at the rate of 2 massacres per each one of 31 military operations. There is absolutely nothing like it. How could the world, which has now communications, how could it really accept that? How could every article of the international law have been violated, crushed, and thrown in dust by Israel and its supporters? How could that happen? One reason how it happened, that the Israeli conquest of Palestine was associated with a large web of deceptions. Deception which could be known to Europe, but they chose to ignore it. One deception is that Palestine is a land without people. When I look at the history of the 19th century, I'm amazed at that. In the Paris Conference in 1919, European colonial powers accepted that because they endorsed Balfour Declaration. But when I looked again at this myth that Palestine is a land without people, it dawned on me that they knew it was not a myth. They deliberately know that it is not a myth. Then what is it? It was actually a plan to make Palestine without people. In other words, it was a plan to apply ethnic cleansing and genocide of Palestinians in Palestine. So it is a plan. So that's one deception. The other deception, when they say, why are you in Palestine? We were defending ourselves. We are in a state of self-defense against the Arab invasion. You hear that in the United States in many books. This is a lie, because the actual invasion was the Zionist invasion. The Zionist invasion started from 1st of April 1948 to 14th of May 1948, when all the Haganah army, which became Israel army later, descended on Palestine and depopulated 220,000 villages, the most important towns in Palestine, including Haifa, Jaffa, and Tiberias. And they actually depopulated all these towns and villages from their homes. They are today making total of half of all refugees of today. And that happened when? It was happened under, we were supposed to be under their protection of the British mandate. The British did not leave them. And that happened not by a country called Israel. It was not established then. It was done by the Haganah. And it was not in self-defense, because no Arab soldier, regular Arab soldiers, had entered Palestine by then. So this is one deception which is now very common in the Zionist literature. The other deception is they say we established Palestine, Israel, on the strength of the partition plan of 1947. Well, first of all, that resolution is not mandatory. It was only a mere suggestion. And because the United Nations says we have no authority to divide countries between people, we only suggest. And in 16th of March 1948, the United Nations itself dropped the partition plan. And so did the United States. And they wanted to put Palestine under UN trusteeship. So the legal thread by which Ben Gurion wanted to hang establishment of his state is gone. It has no value whatsoever. Then they say the refugees actually left on their own. Well, probably they left to have a holiday in the Riviera. And of course, this is rubbish, because they were propelled by massacres in every step of the way, by all kinds of terrorism. And their departure, if it was by their choice, or if it was not by the action of the Israelis, they would have been allowed to return when the hostilities ended. But they were not allowed to return. Instead, their towns and villages were demolished, and their wells from which they drank were poisoned, and all their documents have been stolen. So it was an orgy of death and destruction by Israel for Palestinians. And then they tell you that, well, they cannot return now because the country is full and there is no place for them. I'll come back to this point later. Now, when you actually look at history, whether old or new, You wonder, how could this happen in such a way? All the colonial projects in the past have had limited action by their enemies, like military conquest, like this and that, in, for example, British in India, or the French in Algeria, and so on. The Zionists waged upon the Palestinians something unprecedented in history. They waged against us 10 kinds of wars, 10 kinds of wars. The first war is the military one, by which they occupied the land. We know that. But the second war, it was silencing the voice of the victim. We were not allowed to speak. If we spoke about massacres, expulsion, and so on, we were not allowed to say that. Our voice was silenced. The third war against us was political. When there is a great deal of international law on our side, the Western countries supporting Israel actually vetoed the international law. They muted the international law. And therefore, they waged against us a political war by which the international law was not allowed to come to our help. The fourth war against us is geographical. They wiped out 55,000 names in Palestine, and they replaced them by 6,800 created names, pretending that there is no Palestine and there is Israel represented by these created names. The fifth war against us was historical. Today in Israel, the history of the world between Jesus Christ and the First World War is zero, empty, blank pages. There is no Palestinians, whether Byzantine or Christian or Islamic or anything like that. It's blank. So the history has stopped operating for 2,000 years until the Russian and Polish settlers came to Palestine. The sixth war is archaeological. Every trace of our history is removed. And this is not just a general statement. I have traced the method by which the Israelis demolished 500 villages. They carried with them not only tractors and destroyers and things, they carried with them archaeological team. They look at each stone. If they see there is some value in it, they keep it. Otherwise, they destroy it. They destroyed Byzantine history, Islamic history, Christian history, and all that. So the eighth war is defamation. People now who speak on behalf of Palestinians, whether Palestinians or Europeans or Americans or something, they are defamed, even if they were UN officials. They are saying that you are anti-Semite, the weapon which is used against them. The ninth war is actually the legal war against us. This is called warfare. Now with the rise of the BDS, in many countries and many states in the United States, and certainly in Germany, there are laws which criminalize those who speak about the injustice in Palestine. The 10th war, which is the final one, is economic. Not only it has been used during the British Mandate to create foothold for the Jewish settlers, but now the war against Gaza, which is a blockade, which is actually called incremental genocide, is one supreme example of that. And of course, the restrictions on the West Bank. So these 10 wars waged against us, not only they show that we have been fighting a long war, and many of these wars have not succeeded, but it just tells you, it's an unanswered simple question. Why would people go to such length to wage 10 wars against people who have no tanks and no airplanes? The reason is the Israeli narrative is going against the grain of geography and history and truth and international law. They wanted to create a fictitious structure, and of course, this will not happen. Now, I would like to say back again to the young people. The young people have the banner of the future in their hands. When people say, we have been 70 years since Nakba, some people say, well, we can't, what can we do? We should really probably accept that. No, I derive from this the opposite story. I say that 72 years, the Zionists are trying to force us to give them the title deed, to sign that Palestine is not our land and that it is Israel. They failed, and they continue to fail. As long as they don't have legitimacy from us that our Palestine is their Israel, they will not succeed. And here I rely very much on the young people. Young people today are 75% of the Palestinian population. People say that they forget. Who did not forget? You in Europe and America did not forget. You could have easily had a good life and say we forget about Palestine. But when I see the list on your screen of so many tens of societies who are remembering Nakba and fighting for return and liberation, I feel joy in my heart. And I have never given up on that. How do I do that? We have established in London 20 years ago, Palestine Land Society to document Palestine, and document it not only for the sake of history, not only for the sake of rebuttal of the false Zionist narrative, but actually to plan the return. We have the right for return. Right of return is sacred, legal, possible, and inevitable. So we don't dream about return. We actually plan for it. The first thing we have done is we have now a huge database of all the Palestinian refugees, or to be more accurate, most of Palestinian refugees. And these, we know who they are, we know their names, we know where they come from, we know their property in Palestine, we know also where they live, in which refugee camp. We then can, with a click on our computer, identify anyone, anywhere. Then next step we said, since the whole world is in favor of right of return, supporting resolution 194, 135 times so far, then we have to plan how physically, how it could be implemented. So we planned a network of roads from the camps to their places of origin. And we can calculate how long it takes, how many kilometers, even how many buses we can have to do that. But this is not enough. We then made a study of every village land in Palestine now occupied by Israel. Who lives in their land? Who lives in that land? When people return, what or who will they find in their land? We discovered some 15 years ago a very startling discovery that Palestine of 1948 is still empty. Yes, it is empty. How is it empty? 87% of Israeli Jews still live in 12% of Israel, roughly the same area they lived during the British Mandate, expanded a little bit outside. And all the other lands, for example, we have 247 village lands, they have no Jews at all today. And the rest are dotted with kibbutz and moshav. Why? Because the kibbutz and moshav are actually planted to prevent the return of the refugees. They constitute, all of them, 1 to 2% of Israeli Jews. Take the example of Gaza, for example. Everybody says it's very crowded, but don't tell you why it is crowded. It is crowded because 247 villages in southern Palestine, living in 50% of Palestine, have been crammed by the Israeli ethnic cleansing into Gaza Strip, which has an area of 1.3% of Palestine. Imagine 50% of Palestine is squashed into 1%, and their density of population are 7,000 persons per square kilometer. Now, who took their land? Settlers just to the east, across the barbed wire, their density is only 7 persons per square kilometer, 1,000 times less. If we exchange places, the settlers and the refugees return home, and the settlers in their land were put in refugee camps in Gaza, they hardly fill half a refugee camp in Gaza today. So the injustice is immeasurable. But we went one step further, and we said, since actually there is no obstacle in Palestinian refugees returning, why don't we encourage young people to reconstruct their own villages? So we started 4 years ago a competition among architectural students in the graduating class. We gave them a list of villages, they choose one, and then they design the new village of their family. Usually they select a village where their grandfather came from. And we give them data to help them to do that. One of them is that our population is now 10 times more. We also tell them that you'll have internet, you have this and that. Instead of one small school, you'd have about 4, 5, 6 schools, and so on. And really, I am amazed how creative these young people, like you today, are. Their designs are wonderful. Every year in September, we gather a very distinguished group of architects from Britain, Germany, Ireland, and Arab countries. And they judge the entries from 10 universities. And you have no idea how they impress those even Western judges. For example, young woman from Hula village, she chose her grandfather's house. We gave her a picture of it from aerial survey, and she worked around the village, and she had a wonderful scheme about that. So what I want now to conclude by saying, we are not dreaming about the right of return. We are actually planning for it. And you should carry the banner. Your first requirement is never, ever, never, ever give up your right of return. That is what the Zionists want so badly. They want your signature. If you sign out your right in Palestine, you do, I hope it never happens, a crime to your children and children's children. Never do that. Our legitimacy is in our hand. Nobody can take it away from us. And the second thing is, what you should do is, like this meeting today, you have to study your history, your village, your geography of Palestine. You have to live it in your mind and your heart. We have several atlases. One of them is called the Return Journey, in which you can go to your place in Palestine. It shows 2 layers of information. One of them is what Palestine was and what it is today. Here is the map shown on the screen. All the green areas you can see here are village lands which are free, almost free of Jews. The blue area you see now is the land in which Jews lived during the British Mandate and where they are mostly now here. Next one, you have that. The brown areas are the city's land, just to show you the location of the cities. And if you see black dots on the coast, it is the only place in Palestine where the Jews are majority over Palestinians after 1948. Next one. Next one, if you can. Yes, here I show the concentration of Jews today in Israel. You can see they are in only 3 areas. One around Tel Aviv and Jaffa, and up north in Haifa, and in Western Jerusalem. That is where they are today. So we ask next question. Click, please. You can see now red dots coming up, red dots. Yes, these red dots are the depopulated villages which are now in exile. You can see they can return to their land without interference with the existing Jewish Israelis. I say this because Europeans say you are going to create an Nakba for Jews. This is the work of Arwa Kalalwa. This is her house of her grandfather. This is the present condition. It's now removed completely. That's Rola. And that is her design of the new village. She built it in modern way. It has very modern amenities, and her grandfather's house is still preserved. And so this is her work. She got a prize for it. So I conclude by saying, keep up what you are doing, multiply it by 10 times more. Never, ever give up your right of return. Teach it to your children, teach it to your friends and neighbors, because truth always have a lasting value. It cannot diminish with time, provided the holder of the truth is always keeping it. And the young generation like you, not only they did not forget, but they will fight for the right of return. I'm sure they will do that no matter how long it takes. Good luck to you.
Thank you, Doctor, so much. Again, it's such an honor to have you join us today. We would like to pose one question to you. The question being, you spoke about your work in mapping Palestine, our land, our people, and our return. And so we know that the research is there, we know that the documentation is there, and even the will to return is very present, it's there. So could you speak more to how
Rama?
Yes.
Rama, I just see in the screen a question: how would people reach more information on the subject? As I said, we have Palestine Land Society in London, established 20 years ago, and we have a website called www.PLANS, Palestine Land Society, plans.org. It has lots of information. It has videos, it has flights over Palestine, it has details of population, it has legal matters, social matters, and so on. If anyone is interested, please, you'll find a source full of data. And there is also an icon you can click in case you need more special information.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we'll send the link in a follow-up email so everyone will receive that. I would like for you to speak more to how we, as a movement of Palestinian youth, can actually organize around the right of return. Now that we have the research and the documentation, and we very much hold the will to fight for our right to return, what is your advice to how we can organize around that?
Thank you, Rama. There are a number of steps. When you have a case, you have injustice against you, you go to a lawyer and you try to get your rights back. The first thing is you study your case. You actually have all the documentation, the title deed of your house, your family history, and so on. So the first thing you do is to document your case. As I said a moment ago, the Israelis lived on deceiving the Western world. Deception, which is unique in the history of the world. Even the Americans did not do it in Vietnam, and the French did not do it in Algeria, but the Zionists did a great web of deception. So the first thing to do is actually to document your case of Palestine and teach it to your brothers and sisters and to your children later and so on. You have to keep the flame alight. You should not give us that, because who actually try to deceive other people? The people who are afraid of the truth. You are not afraid of the truth, but you have to make it known. Make it known. The second thing, after the information is known to you and to your friend, you have to activate it. It has to be made into a social and even political force. So all your societies, which you have shown on the screen, should get together, should have regular quarterly meeting of the year, every 3 months, and actually make working groups with a strategy, with realizable plans. How you can make, for example, videos about Palestine, how you can make stories, how you can create, how you can correct history books, how you correct curriculum in schools, how you can rebut every lie about us in the media. You can create Wikipedia, for example, is used so much by the Zionists to propagate lies. You can create a team of young people who are academically inclined, and they will answer everything wrong in the Wikipedia or in the press. The third stage is you want to turn this into a political force. And that is by having, for example, an annual conference where you have all these people getting together. You transfer your thoughts and voice into a political force by talking to your MP and so on. We, in 2017, as a result of several conferences before, we established Palestinian Conference for Palestinians Abroad. It is actually not in America, only in Europe and the Arab world. This is one unit. But the final list, which is the absolutely necessary list, is that we go back to the achievement we made in 1964 by converting the Palestinian people from a bunch of refugees into a people who have a country, and we created the Palestine National Council. Unfortunately, since Oslo, which is a big disaster, worse than Balfour Declaration, this situation has undermined our national rights. So you young people who are now actually more than half of all Palestinians, you should arrange plans, campaigns, and so on, calling for new elections for all Palestinians, 13 million people. You should say, we have no voice. We should have a voice in Palestine National Council. It's now hijacked by people who do not represent us. And we should, first step we have to do is we clean up our Palestinian house by a democratic broom. This democratic broom will clean up the mess in the Palestinian house, and we have representative from you young people to lead Palestine in the generation to come. So these steps, I know it's not easy. We have been trying since Oslo to do that with the late Edward Said, Ibrahim Abloud, Haider Abdel Shafi, Shafi al-Hout, but we have to continue that until your voice is heard, and you force the people who are sitting in the seat of our leadership by saying our right is to be represented. If someone is not elected, he doesn't represent us. We have to do that. It's not easy, but we have to do it. So these are the multi-stage process by which young people have to do. You start with one and follow. But the golden rule, never, ever give up.
Thank you so much, Doctor. In the interest of time, I'm seeing that a lot of people submitted questions, but in the interest of time, we will try to address more of their questions toward the end of our program. So thank you so much, Dr. Salman Abu Sitta. It was such an honor to have you with us today. And again, if you want to read and learn more about his work and the work of the Palestine Land Society, the website is www.plans.org.
Plans.org. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank
and
you,
we'll
Rama.
put that in follow-up materials as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rama. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So next, we will be inviting Nadia Younes. Nadia is a community organizer and graduate student in education. Her work blurs the line between academia and community, as evidenced by her involvement in the Palestinian community over the past decade. After receiving her MA in Middle Eastern Studies from the American University of Beirut in 2013, she co-founded the Naqab Center for Youth Activities, which is a youth-led community center in Burj El Barajne camp. The Naqab Center works to improve the lives of refugees in the camp through educational, cultural, and social activities, and foster a sense of awareness and responsibility amongst its youth. Nadia is currently a doctoral student in the Faculty of Education at York University in Toronto, Canada, and her research focuses on decolonizing education for Palestinians in Lebanon. Nadia will be joining us today. She's joining us from Lebanon, and she'll be speaking on the ongoing struggle of Palestinian refugees, specifically in Lebanon, and also giving us insight into the conditions there today, as well as speaking to the role of the diaspora in our ongoing liberation movement. So with that, I welcome Nadia Younes and invite her to begin. Nadia, if you're with us.
Hello.
Hi, welcome. Okay, the mic is yours.
Okay, thank you for the lovely introduction. I want to, of course, thank Sausan, Lina, and Dr. Abu Sitta for your presentations. I'm happy to speak to you today representing Naqab Center for Youth Activities in Burj El Barajne camp. We are a grassroots youth-led community center that has grown over the past 7 years with our programs, as well as our members and volunteers. Among our members have been Palestinians from the camps and gatherings across Lebanon, Palestinians from the wider diaspora, Syrian refugees, Lebanese youth from Lebanon and abroad, and visiting solidarity activists. I think of the center as our temporary home and a place that I hope you all choose to learn more about after this webinar. Now, when I think of 72 years since the start of the Nakba, I think of the ongoing displacement and attempted erasure of people that continue steadfast in their struggle for liberation. When I think of the Nakba, I think of 72 years of ethnic cleansing and emergence of an apartheid state to the south of my father's village. When I reflect on the past 72 years of war and destruction, I think of the violence of borders and the brutality of occupation. When I think of the Zionist project, I think of the ugly face of the European settler colonial tradition that continues to be supported by the most powerful countries in the world, the structure of destroying indigenous tradition in order to replace it, the myth of the added value of modernism and individualism, and the destruction of the collective on our lands. When I think of the years that continue to pass, I think of the elders that we continue to lose and the memory of homelands that we fight to keep. I think about solidarity with Palestinians. When I think about solidarity with Palestinians, I think about the more space being made for Palestinian refugees, including those from Lebanon. Palestinians have existed in Lebanon as long-term refugees and aspiring returnees since 1948, when the first wave of indigenous people sought refuge from settler colonial onslaught of historic Palestine. The first refugees to arrive at the start of the Nakba were mostly from the northern coastal villages and cities of Palestine. them being Safad, Akka, Haifa, and Jaffa districts. At the time, the majority, but not all, settled in the land later to be designated as refugee camps by the International Committee of Red Cross, which was rented from the Lebanese government and later put under the auspices of UNRWA after it was established in 1950. The area of the camps amounted to 1 kilometer square. Housing in the camps was always meant to be temporary, although today with urban expansion, extending past the officially designated area of the camps in most cases, it is difficult to distinguish where the camp ends and the neighboring suburb begins. That is with the exception of the kind reminder by the courtesy of the Lebanese government via checkpoints, walls, and barbed wire. Since first settling in tents, the camps have seen various levels of transformation in terms of construction as well as destruction. From tents to later zinc roofs to concrete structures built up over the years. Now on the surface level, they might just resemble densely populated, underserved communities. It is important to note that up until the conflict in Syria, starting in 2011, the situation of Palestinians in Lebanon was considered to be the worst in the Arab world outside of Palestine. Palestinians in Lebanon today live in the 12 of the 15 original refugee camps and over 43 unofficial gatherings, in addition to those residing outside the camps and other urban centers around Lebanon, those which now constitute the majority of Palestinians in Lebanon. Diana Allen refers to Palestinian youth in Lebanon today to be refugees of the revolution. They are second, third, and in some cases, fourth generation refugees, the majority of whom were born in Lebanon during the aftermath of the Lebanese Civil War, which ended technically in 1990. However, Palestinians continue to be treated as foreigners under Lebanese law. And the more time that is passing in the ongoing Nakba, the more discriminatory the laws become for foreigners, specifically targeting Palestinians. Although there are around 425,000 registered refugees in Lebanon, it is suspected that approximately 260,000 to 280,000 currently reside in the country. The unforgiving laws that deny Palestinians the right to own property, to work, to education, to adequate healthcare, to social security, make life almost unlivable and cause Palestinians to risk their lives and livelihoods to seek opportunities elsewhere. Imagine a world where Palestinians in Lebanon were supported to thrive and to return to their liberated homeland. Most of the time, what we find are politicians paying mouth service to the cause and actively operating in benefit of the Zionist project. It is important to acknowledge the effects of the conflict in Syria on access for funding, access for donor funding and services. Approximately 1.2 million Syrian refugees and over 440,000 Palestinian refugees from Syria began arriving to Lebanon as late as 2012. Lebanese social infrastructure, which operates according to the sectarian system, proved unforgiving, not only to marginalized Lebanese citizens, but specifically to the refugees, new and old. It is important to note that Lebanon is not a signatory to the international conventions for refugees. As a result, Palestinians in Lebanon have been treated by the state from 1948 until now as security threats. Although there have been moments of solidarity between Lebanese and Palestinians, Palestinians continue to be implicated in conflicts in Lebanon throughout the past 72 years. And as a result, the community is witness to and itself experience a far share of discrimination, trauma, and hardship. The establishment of the Palestinian Liberation Organization in 1964, and specifically the Cairo Agreement of 1970, that permitted the PLO to carry out a liberation struggle from Lebanon had a significant positive effect at the time on the situation of Palestinian refugees. It changed their situation from a disenfranchised group with no autonomy and a relatively low level of control of their situation to a recognized community with an internationally respected cause. It resulted in what Rosemary Saïd calls a state within a state, with various PLO institutions that were able to develop throughout the camps of Lebanon during this period, which included healthcare, early childhood education, a research center, etc. The factions took their role seriously in the camps, the political factions, that is, during this revolutionary period, and worked on the survival of the community as well as the community's intellectual development during their taking up of the liberation struggle. Between 1970 and 1982, the Lebanese National Movement, in alliance with the Lebanese National Movement, the PLO transformed South Lebanon and the camps into a zone for national liberation struggle. Yet due to the forced withdrawal of PLO from Lebanon following the second Zionist invasion of Lebanon in 1982, Palestinians faced major setbacks in terms of infrastructure and representation. And although at the start of the Lebanese Civil War, there were alliances between Palestinian and Lebanese political factions under the Lebanese National Movement, the Palestinians received the bulk of the blame for the Lebanese Civil War in national discourse. This had a clear negative impact on policies regarding their rights within the country, which were already unstable. Although the situation of Palestinians in Lebanon today does not paint the same picture of hope and pride and the glory years experienced during the revolutionary period, the lasting effect of community mobilizing through service cannot be denied. And this I will talk more about later. In 2001, Edward Said spoke to the struggle of Palestinians in Lebanon to survive. He said, quote, "Almost 400,000 Palestinian refugees have had to endure not only the massacres of Sabra, Shatila, Tal al-Za'atar, the Bayyi, and elsewhere, but have remained confined in hideous quarantine for almost 2 generations. They have no legal right to work in at least 60 occupations. They are not adequately covered by medical insurance. They cannot travel and return, and they are objects of suspicion and dislike." Today, we are witnessing increasing cuts to UNRWA service provision, leaving Palestinian refugees in even more precarious situation. UNRWA funding has always been unstable. It is allocated voluntarily by donor countries. Considering the political climate, Trump's decision to revoke US funding should not be surprising. Yes, we criticize UNRWA, not to end it, not to put it aside and replace it, but to make it better. We recognize that UNRWA was never a tool of our resistance, but it does have a responsibility for the survival of our people, because it was the UN itself that paved the way for continuing colonizations of our land. The hot and cold game being played with UNRWA service provision has for the most part turned cold over the past 70 years of its operation. This highlights the precarity of the Palestinian refugee community in the post-Oslo era, a time where the Palestinian Authority's state-building efforts replaced the PLO's liberation struggle. It is almost as if UNRWA's gradual withdrawal and deterioration of services is intentionally pushing Palestinians to search for other options. They are changing the conversation from a political decision to stopping services to one of the oldest refugee populations in the world and turning it into a humanitarian issue of aid that could be easily passed off to another agency. But Palestinians in Lebanon are not falling for it. They are constantly protesting the withdrawal of UNRWA services and demanding that UNRWA, that UNRWA steps up and provides what it's supposed to. The developments of the last year have been blow after blow for the Palestinian community in Lebanon. In June 2019, the Lebanese Minister of Labor took strict measures against foreign workers in Lebanon, and he lumped Palestinian refugees to be included in that bunch, despite the fact that they have been residing in the country for more than 70 years. This, in turn, led many Palestinians to lose their jobs and others to shut down businesses. This decision came after years of pressuring international organizations to apply a quota for employment of Palestinian refugees. There had to be a balance, a certain number of Lebanese employees to employ one Palestinian. This has ultimately stirred up fury and rage in the Palestinian camps in which refugees came out revolting against such racist decisions in the absence of decent laws that protect Palestinians' right to work. All the camps and the Palestinian communities closed down. There were protests held inside the camps and communities. Yet, Lebanese government did not respond. When the Lebanese revolution started in October 2019, the country was completely put on hold. With ongoing road closures, the economy experienced a free fall, and the banking system started collapsing. The uprising forced Palestinians to use all their savings and has intensified the gap of poverty amongst refugees. As a result, the camps, through all that chaos, have not been prepared to face the corona pandemic in which thousands of families suffer to maintain their living during lockdown on their own. Now, the hope in all of this, the role of the diaspora. The role of the diaspora during this time has varied from sharing resources and networking opportunities with Palestinian refugees to sharing and making space for Palestinian refugees in the conversation about justice for Palestine, just like the organizers have done today. Personally, as a returnee from the US to Lebanon back in 2008, I have seen my role as using my privilege for the sake of the cause. I recognize that I was born within a certain context that has allowed me to mobilize resources in the diaspora to ensure the sustainability of a truly independent, volunteer-based youth center in Burj Barajni camp. And it is truly something beautiful, and I love it very much. And I really hope that you guys really want to learn about. And I just saw a question asking to volunteer, and yeah, of course you can. We're ready as soon as Corona's over. Okay. On countless occasions, the diaspora has been there to sustain our efforts. And specifically, PYN has been there on more than one occasion to help us out with fundraising. But it is incredibly necessary that we continue to find opportunities to use our voices in the diaspora to speak truth to power and connect with each other. The most recent campaign for Palestinian refugees in Lebanon is an example of the diaspora in the West responding to a call from a Naqab Center and the Palestinian Cultural Club in Lebanon. Such initiatives are an explanation of what is necessary. Okay, but it is not money alone that is needed here. It is every single Palestinian in the diaspora. Every single Palestinian in the diaspora is required to connect, to talk to each other, learn about each other, to figure out the strengths, to figure out what each other needs. And that is what the path to return looks like. We need to speak to each other. We need to just be there for each other. I hope to see more of these types of mobilizations in the future because they can remind us and remind Palestinians in Lebanon that we are not alone and we are not forgotten and we are not foreigners, but simply displaced in a neighboring country, and our return to historic Palestine is inevitable. And I'd rather take questions. Yeah, that's it. Bye.
Thank you, Nadia. So let's see if we have any questions from the audience. So we have a question asking, what are ways we can further solidarity between Lebanese in the South and Palestinian refugees in Lebanon today, given the fracture of solidarity with current conditions despite our common struggles?
Yes, so that is a difficult question because I don't know if you know this, but it is actually not possible for Palestinians to go beyond the Litani River, so they cannot actually visit the South. So that makes it more complicated when it comes to solidarity between Lebanese in the South when the freedom of movement is not guaranteed for Palestinian refugees. It looks more like Lebanese in the South taking it upon themselves to talk to Palestinians in Lebanon, even though prior there did exist relationships between them. Yes. Another question, I'm good. Oh yeah, I'm also Lebanese from the South, so it's fun.
Thanks, Nadia. I have a question for you. You spoke a little bit about the efforts by PYM and other organizations to actually support our people in the camps in a more material way. Could you speak more to what that
looks like,
what that support means in a political sense? Because yes, in the face of a pandemic and in the face of other infrastructural issues, there is a dire need of material support. But as people in exile and in the diaspora, what does that mean politically? It is relief work, it is material support, but what does that mean politically?
So it is relief work and material support when necessary, and it is going to be necessary on more than one occasion when we look at the past, decade of what has been happening. Obviously, what is also necessary is these connections that can be made not only in the event of asking for funding, but for example, there have been occasions in the past where Palestinian refugees from Lebanon have been invited to different conferences or different webinars like these series, and for people to actually connect and build solidarity through the common struggle of being outside their homeland. So the whole idea of Palestinians in the diaspora, either in the West or wherever, or in exile in Lebanon, actually making connections that does play a political role, because just recognizing that the other exists is power against the colonizer. Yeah. So I think that what is needed is that we need more opportunities to connect in meaningful ways, and yes. I don't know what that looks like right now. Corona sucks.
We did successfully raise money to send packages to our people in the camps, and that's been an ongoing campaign of ours. So there is some support we can be lending in the meantime. But I want to thank you, Nadia.
Just one thing.
Yes.
Yeah. The thing about including Palestinian refugees in the conversation, I think using a voice, you know, because for some reason, voices in the West seem to be heard more than voices in the camps in Lebanon. And that is a shame, but it is the case. So if you don't know what is going on with Palestinians in Lebanon, I'm happy that I got to tell you about it today. But it is also something that you need to take upon yourself to ask the questions and ask yourself why you don't know. There is a certain reason why you don't know, and it's definitely part of the ethnic cleansing project that has been going on for the past 72 years. But you are capable of more than you actually realize. And I think that the many attempts to tell us to be practical and tell us that return is not possible is just, it's all a bunch of bullshit. Because if we actually work together and if we actually get to know each other, and just like Dr. Salman Abu Sitta said, if we actually demand elections and representation, and if we actually raise our voices, that is something. It is the power that is telling us that it is not possible.
Thank you, Nadia, for all your thoughts and your presentation. In the interest of time, we will be moving on in our program. Thank you, Nadia, so much. So I do want to thank Lina and Suzanne and Dr. Abu Sitta and Nadia again for being with us today and sharing your incredible insights and your decades of contributions to this movement. We also want to thank everyone who came today for your questions and engagement. We do want to conclude in a little bit with some tangible ways you can plug in and take action. And before I hand it off to Muhammad to conclude, I want to invite Pietro from the Palestinian Return Center in London to talk more about the Global Right of Return campaign, which was launched earlier this year and will be continuing for the next year. So with that, Pietro, I invite you to share more about the campaign.
Hello, thank you. Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you're joining from. First of all, thanks to the Palestinian Youth Movement, SJP, and everyone that has helped organize this event. And it's a great pleasure to be speaking to you today. Thanks also to the previous speakers who have provided really inspiring presentations about the Nakba and from different perspectives and its current manifestations. I really appreciate having the opportunity and space to briefly talk about the My Return campaign. This is my only aim today, and it is to introduce the campaign for those who haven't heard about it. I've been told I have very few minutes, so I'll be very concise. The campaign comes in response to the US and Israeli attempts to further entrench a settler colonial project in Palestine. And the latest manifestation of this project is the so-called deal of the century, which, as Rafif Ziada recently described it is rather an annexation policy, which we see being further advanced on the ground. And the other crucial component is the denial of the right to return and the continued erasure of Palestinian refugees, which has escalated in various forms, whether it is defunding UNRWA or denying the legitimacy of the refugee status or shooting at Great March of Return protesters in the besieged Gaza Strip as they were attempting to return and reclaim their lands. So in this climate, this environment, at the beginning of the year, the PRC began this international campaign, which has a rather straightforward and modest goal, which is just to obtain as much support as possible by asking Palestinians and supporters to sign an online petition, which states that essentially the right to return is an inalienable right that cannot be negotiated away, and any peace plan that negates it should be rejected. At this stage of the campaign, the plan is to collect as many signatures as possible. Initially, efforts were made to do this on the ground in refugee camps and elsewhere, But obviously with the COVID-19 crisis, everything is being done online at the moment. I'm glad to say we have passed over 160,000 signatures this week. Considering it was launched at the end of February, there has been some good progress. The goal, however, is to keep going and reach as many signatures as possible. And I want to use this opportunity to ask listeners to sign the petition by going to the myreturn.net website and to share it within your networks as much as possible. And I'll conclude just by mentioning what we're thinking of the next step of the campaign is to hopefully, by having showed internationally that there is a popular mandate and a continued support for the right to return, this will enable to create some momentum to shift the focus of activists or unions or political party and broadly the solidarity movement towards centering the promotion and to defend the return of Palestinian refugees. That's all for me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Pietro, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for inviting us to partake in the Global Right of Return campaign. This campaign is very important, and it speaks to how we can center the right of return in our organizing and offers us a concrete way to do so. The Palestinian Youth Movement, of course, is endorsing the campaign, and we encourage everyone to sign on to the petition at myreturn.net. Again, I want to thank our presenters for sharing with us your work and your invaluable knowledge. We wanted to take this moment in our history to reaffirm our pledge as Palestinians to carrying forward our struggle. Through culture, organization, mutual aid, and the formulation of a collective vision for the future, we can build a path for liberation. I want to briefly highlight some of the key points presented today during this webinar, the first of which, resistance takes many forms, including cultural production. However, we must not see them as one and the same. Cultural production provides us so much more. It helps us to understand ourselves, our shared experiences, our differing experiences, our shared and differing tastes, perceptions, and emotions. Culture not only allows us to resist or acts as a vehicle for resistance, but it allows us to survive and thrive, to build community and shared vision, to learn and know ourselves and one another. Return, our right of return. Return is not a hope or a dream or an aspiration. It is a promise, and even more so, it is a plan. One that we must undertake, one that we are responsible for enacting. We must do so by organizing, by raising our banners, and by building power for our struggle. We must center our people in the camps who have endured decades of oppression, indifference, discrimination, and exploitation. We must support them in their institutions so they remain steadfast, and we must recenter them and their struggles in our demands for a just future. We must build and rebuild institutions, our institutions in the diaspora and across the diaspora. We must rebuild our networks and our connections. Us, we here in the diaspora, wherever we may find ourselves, must reaffirm today and forever our unwavering commitment to our struggle. The youth, our youth, must join the struggle and must take up the mantle of our struggle and reclaim our role in our national struggle. Today, on this 72nd anniversary of the mass expulsion of our people, we reaffirm our pledge to redeem our martyrs and our prisoners, and to redeem our land and our nation. So with that said, please follow the calls to action, sign on to our Right of Return campaign at myreturn.net, follow the PYM to learn more about this. Please also check out the local mutual aid programs that the PYM is engaged in response to the COVID pandemic. We believe through mutual aid and solidarity, can we support one another in difficult times and extend the call for justice and liberation, the call for community power and building through this work. We also call to support the Ghassan Kanafani Resistance Art Scholarship. You can purchase the anthology on the PYM website, and you can also join us for our Ghassan Kanafani online launch party. Again, it's on May 31st at 4 p.m. PST, 7 p.m. Eastern. Palestinian and Arab youths above the age of 18, join our struggle, join the PYM. You can find more information and sign up to join through pymusa.com/join. And now follow PYM and NSJP on our social media to get updates on our political campaigns, our political education series with NSJP, and to learn more about how to get involved, whether it's on campus or in your community. With that, we will close today's webinar. We hope that you will visit our website, reach out to us, follow us on social media, apply to join, and become a member or supporter of the PYM. Follow NSJP and PYM updates on our campaigns and future webinars. We appreciate everyone for taking the time to join us today, and we are happy to have been able to provide the opportunity to virtually bring us together as a community during this time. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day, and Ramadan Mubarak to those who are observing.